Welcome to Artforum at Sotheby's. I'm David Velasco, the editor-in-chief of Artforum magazine. I'm standing in the new museum where we're about to take a tour of Grief and Grievance, Art and Mourning in America, a show that was conceived by Okwui Enwezor for the new museum in 2018. This is going to be the first in a series of talks between Artforum and Sotheby's, and I'll be joined by Malik Gaines, the artist, for a tour of the show for those of you who can't see it.
Hi, I'm Malik Gaines. I'm an artist and associate professor of performance studies at NYU Tisch School of the Arts. I'm moderating tonight's conversation. Okwui Enwezor was such a tremendously influential figure. He did these groundbreaking shows around African work like Insight and The Short Century. He did Venice Biennial and a number of other important biennials. He did Documenta. He had posts in Munich in the United States. He did a number of really consequential exhibitions. The statement that Okwui Enwezor wrote really orients this show around the current political crisis in the United States and thinking about grief as the condition of Black life and grievance as the orientation that whiteness has played in the recent kinds of turmoil in our political structure. To describe that as an emergency, though, is an interesting kind of double figure because, as the theorist Saidiya Hartman really lays out in the catalog, if you consider the afterlife of slavery, if you consider the extractive and dispossessive project of capitalism and modernity, if you think about the forms of escape, fugitivity that engenders, this is a perpetual crisis. So an emergency at once and one that is the common everyday experience of terror of Black life. So the ways that works out in these artworks is interesting. There's a really important attention to photography. There is a lot of really important work that explores abstraction in different ways. And there are a lot of works that do a kind of Black conceptualism that integrates conceptual, minimal, assemblage, a variety of approaches to making forms that both have material presence and a kind of critical surround. Hello everyone, I'm Malik Gaines, and I'd like to welcome you to this special event, which is part of Artforum at Sotheby's series organized in partnership with Intelligence Squared. A special thanks to Sotheby's for providing the platform for this conversation. Today, we're going to talk about the exhibition Grief and Grievance, Art and Mourning in America, which has just opened at the new museum in New York City. The exhibition was first conceived by the Nigerian curator, Okwui Enwezor, who died in 2019. It has been put together by a group of eminent curators and artists in Okwi's memory, and it features works by 37 US American artists which address mourning, commemoration, and loss. As Enwezor wrote in his statement, the crystallization of Black grief in the face of a politically orchestrated white grievance represents the fulcrum of this exhibition. And as scholar Christina Sharp puts it in her incredible catalog essay, the artists in this exhibition are, quote, working the materials of Black life. In many works, as in the painted collages of Jenny C. Jones, abstraction allows for a dismantling of prohibitive structures. Elsewhere, it produces a kind of climate responsive to what artist Glenn Ligon has called the ill wind of anti-Blackness. At the same time, the strong presence of photography, video, and performance offers a will to represent against the brutality of misrepresentation. And, as in the deep and often theatrical works of Carrie Mae Weems, the possibility of fabulating sharper images of our history, our present, and our future. A complicity of abstraction and representation can be observed in the moving and critical assemblages and sculptural forms present in the show, such as this challenging work by Tiana Nikia McLaughlin, that reworks an agricultural device used in slaughter. Here and elsewhere, we see the thick entanglement of material with its social and political applications. These works, many are beautiful, many are moving, and some are quite difficult for me to look at. And in her catalog essay, Christina Sharp quotes the late artist Jack Whitten, who wrote, quote, "The structuring of a viable worldview is hard work and filled with risk. I want a world without the poisonous sickness of racism, without romantic fantasies of being Black or white." And further, Whitten says, "My paintings teach me how to live." So with that kind of living in mind on the other side of death, I'd like to turn now to our four remarkable speakers. Joining us from Chicago, we have Naomi Beckwith, who is Manilow Senior Curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago, and also one of the show's curatorial advisors. Welcome, Naomi.
Thank you so much, Malik. I'm so happy to be in this conversation.
And in New York, we have Julie Mehretu, an artist known for her multi-layered paintings of abstracted landscapes on a large scale. Hi, Julie.
Hi, I'm really happy to be here with all of you too. Thank you.
And often in Chicago and maybe elsewhere now, we have Theaster Gates, an artist whose works engage with space theory and land development, sculpture and performance. He is a professor at the University of Chicago in the Department of Visual Arts and the Harris School of Public Policy. Hi, Theaster.
Hey, how's it going? What a pleasure.
All right. And in New York City, we have Massimiliano Gioni, artistic director of the new museum and one of the curatorial advisors to the Grief and Grievance exhibition. Hello, Massimiliano.
Hi, everybody. Great to see you. Thank you so much for being here.
So I wanted to jump right into the conversation. This is a theme that can't really be skirted around, and none of these works do. In the exhibition catalog for Grief and Grievance, Saidiya Hartman asked the question directly, how do we attend to Black death? And we can think about that question specifically with Judith Butler's query in mind, observing the difficulty of rectifying such a loss. She asks, when the law is the problem, to whom do you appeal? So under this condition, Black artists often appeal to our own imagination and expression, drawing on a beautiful history of Black expressivity and imagination for survival. I wonder at this time, can those resources be exhausted? So if anyone would love to wade into that territory with me, I'd love to kick off the conversation. Maybe I can turn to you, Naomi.
Thank you, Malik. Thank you also for a really incredible and beautiful framing of the exhibition, the project, and introducing this talk. It's really great to have you here moderating. I love that question. How do we attend to Black death? How do we attend to it in its mode of being perpetual and incessant? And I love the way you actually framed it also in relationship to the Judith Butler comment about not having a recourse to justice, not having a recourse to grievance. Judith Butler did something really smart, I think, in this catalog, which is to talk about the ways in which grief and grievance look like related terms. They look as though they come from the same root, but they are faux amis. They aren't related. One is really about attending to loss, and the other is about a recourse to justice, a recourse to some kind of action and retribution. And what she rightly points out is, as you said, artists who are grieving, Black people who are grieving, often don't have recourse and rarely have recourse to justice. So it's not just about the sense of loss, it's also about having any sort of retribution for close. The show proposes, I think, that the way to crystallize Black grief is as myriad as all the artists in the show. There are multiple strategies, multiple ways on offer in the exhibition. You've already quoted Jack Whitten, who is really thinking about a kind of critique of that anti-Black violence, and ways in which he takes care of himself by learning through form. I think you see in the show also forms of resistance to and through that grief, and not resistance in an oppositional way, but resistance in almost an Epicurean way. And I'm thinking about sort of Dina Lawson's photographs of people gathering together and celebrating, but celebrating the loss that came before, the loss of ancestors, celebrating even being in the midst of Black death. There's self-care. Rashid Johnson's Antoine's Oregon gives you the space of life and really a balm and a salve and a mental respite. So, you know, these are all creative resources artists have created for themselves. And when you ask whether or not it can be exhausted, I think the answer is that it can't be. That state of emergency, which is critical and perpetual, has basically engendered a condition of instinct. And those instincts and that sort of creative will to represent will be around as long as the condition of anti-Blackness is around.
Mm. Thank you. And Julie, I wonder if you want to comment on this.
Yeah, I mean, to continue with that, I think absolutely. I mean, those resources, the resource, if that resource of imagination, creativity, and reaching back, this and making art. I mean, that practice and that resource has been a part of humanity, has been a part of who we've been for millions, hundreds and thousands of years. And to think about, to not be, there is no way that can ever be exhausted. I think what can be exhausted, and one of the challenges, I think it's almost absurd to think that that resource, like to think about that aspect being exhausted. I think one of the reasons that can even come up in the conversation is that there's an exhaustion in the reception of that. There are plenty of institutional historical limits on the reception of what is possible by Black artists, and what is possible in what can be made from grief and grievance, and what is possible in what's represented, or in what's or it's in abstraction. And I think that's a failure on the public, and the failure of of institutions and the perception, because in confronting works like that, there's this kind of confrontation with the failure of democracy, with the failure of a desired reality. So that these shows are the experience of this work, and the continuity of this work, and the insistence of this work, from what Sadia Hartman refers to, those two girls in the hold, and the witnessing of that, and that form of, abject sublime that we see in Arthur AJ's film, and thinking of that form of continuity and what possibility at the same time is core to what we do. And I think that's where the challenge comes. But I also think there can't be a determinate kind of regard for artists of color and Black artists who constantly are making within a context of trauma, within a context of embodied trauma, within a daily reality of that. So there's no what is generated from that, whatever that is, and whatever is a will. If that is a will of those artists to go there, that exhaustion only can happen on the other side. So.
Right. And Theaster, would you like to add to this?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll continue Julie's reflection in that if there are makers who make because they live in an environment of the pastoral, and they make landscapes that reflect the cows that are in their backyards, then that pastoral engagement might continue. But if there's a part of art that is engaged in the intensity of the now, in the truth of these transgressions that happen within public space, that in my case, I know that people's practices become responsive to the times. And what we may find is that in the same way that you see an acceleration in the death toll, you might find artists transforming their practices in response to the now. And so I think that there might be moments where the form starts to shift from what we've conventionally known as artistic practice towards something else. Like, I know people who have put down their paintbrushes and decided to march instead, because there was a way in which both art has the power to do a thing, but I also think that the truth of life sometimes requires that we transform our forms. And so the thing that I'm excited about is that there are moments when revolutionary acts sometimes cause us to do things that are not in the nature of our artistic practice, but seem necessary for the time.
Right, absolutely. And this is reminding me of somewhere else in the catalog, someone quotes my esteemed colleague, Fred Moten, and I'm paraphrasing because I didn't write it down, but he says something like, as much as I love all the stuff we made under these conditions, I think I might like the stuff we make not under these conditions better. And that itself is a form of imagination, to sort of to think about, to speculate about that place where conditions are different. Yeah, thank you so much for those thoughts. And I want to turn to Massimiliano to ask a little bit about how this show came together. The exhibition, Grief and Grievance, can you talk about the process and how your conversation evolved with Okwui Enwezor? And are there any specific works you want to pull out that synthesize the ideas of the show?
Yeah, the exhibition started as a conversation with Okwui in 2018. At that time, Okwui was contributing to 2 catalogs for exhibitions at the New Museum, which were surveys of Jonah Comfra and Nari Ward, the 2 artists that Okwui had known since the 1990s and had included most famously in his 2002 Documenta. So he was writing for both books, and because of that reason, we were in touch more frequently. And he started telling me about this idea of a series of lectures that he was asked to deliver at Harvard, which he had titled Grief and Grievance, Art and Mourning in America. And he told me a little bit about the premises of those lectures, and it came spontaneous and almost automatic to ask him, why don't you turn this into a show? Having also the knowledge that Okwui, in a sense, was a great writer, but also he was a writer in space through his formidable exhibitions. And he took on the invitation with great enthusiasm and energy, with those qualities that always really animated his projects. And he started working on the show. One of the very first things he asked, the show was actually supposed to happen in the summer of 2020. That was our schedule, and he insisted so much, and now I laugh about it, but he insisted very much that the show needed to open before the election, before the American election, and we shifted around the schedule for him because his insistence was also contagious, and so we decided that the show would have happened in October 2020, which turned out to be impossible because of COVID and because it was impossible just to open a show when museums were mostly closed in New York City until September. So in 2018, he started working on the show. He worked restlessly on it through until March 2019. Okwui sadly died the 15th of March 2019. I spoke to him on 1st of March 2019, and he was saying, I still have the text messages, sad as that sound, in which he says we shall have a great exhibition. And, he was working until the end. We learned from Glenn, who went to see him around that time, from Arthur Jaffa, from Julie, from many artists in the show, that he was talking to them about the exhibition. He was making plans, and he really worked until the very end. In fact, in January, he told me he had asked Glenn Ligon to become an advisor on the show. He described him as an interlocutor. He said he wanted somebody in New York, somebody connected to many younger artists, even though Glenn is always careful to say that Okwui was much more knowledgeable about younger artists than he himself. But anyway, it was an invitation that we all understood also as a way for Okwui to organize a continuity and a legacy for the show, shall he not been able to see the completion. And in fact, after his passing, we started talking with Glenn, we started talking with Okwi's family, with his partner, with many artists and friends, and we realized there was a consensus that this show was important to him, that it was far enough in the planning. He had written the narrative for the show, he had made list of artists, list of works. he had selected the contributors to the catalog and so on and so forth. So we thought it was important to see the project through. And with Glenn, we decided to create a kind of team with Mark Nash, who is a curator and had been a friend of Okwui since 1997, I believe, and co-curated many of the shows that he had worked on. And with Naomi Beckwith, who is a curator from a younger generation. She can certainly speak about her own relationship with Okwui, but it was most symbolically, she was a curator that Okwui had chosen also to be on the jury of his Venice Biennale, testifying to an ongoing dialogue between the two of them. And so altogether, we took on this role of sort of philological completion and kind of interpretative freedom, and that's how the project was delivered. Okwui had left the list of works, list of artists, had conceived also a kind of choreography of the show on the 3 floors. As you see here, this piece by Nari Ward was actually at the inception of the exhibition. It was a work that had been lost and destroyed in 1995, and Okwui asked Nari to recreate it, and so the dialogue started. And actually, I think the most moving aspect, which is not so apparent in the show, was the response of the artists, the way they all came through with amazing works and with great generosity, and I think that is really the testimony of how dear the relationship with Okwui was for all of them. I could go on for hours, so I'll shut up and pass on the word to you, Malik, again, and see if I can help with other questions later.
Sure, thank you so much for that background, and it's great to see some of the installation images. We could widen this out a little bit and talk about Okwi's legacy and influence. One of the things we had talked about, Naomi, was this way, many of us encountered African art through shows like The Short Century, and have encountered it in a different way since then. So I wonder if that's one of the things you would talk about in terms of Okwi's legacy.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to. You're absolutely right. I mean, the word is the encounter. I work at the MCA Chicago, and it was the first U.S. venue for this short century. Independence and liberation movements in Africa from 45 to 1994, really thinking about African art framed historically in the dates of post-coloniality, from the earliest sort of movements into the independence of Eritrea. But really what Okwui was offering was a way of framing African art vis-a-vis the contemporary. And there were exhibitions that had African artists in it, particularly Les Magiciens de la Terre, which was kind of like a negative motivating force for Okwui. But those shows and many presentations across the world in museum collections presented Africa as a site of either ritual object production or literally a site of magicians. Everything was through the mystical and the magical. And so Okwui really brought to the fore in this compendium exhibition the argument that Africa also is contemporary. Africa has had its own modernisms. And really through that show, not only did he introduce the idea of African modernism, but he was really one of the first to start to articulate the idea of multiple modernisms for many people. So the legacy of the show wasn't just an education around the continent, but also a re-education around curatorial practice. There was the multiple modernisms, there was his moves in including mass media and popular forms alongside fine art, really testing and questioning where culture is located, what it looks like when it's produced en masse. And he also, I believe, really started to put pressure on the idea of the global that was rising at that moment too. Everyone had talked about the move from the international to the global, but really those conversations were about Western Europe, Northern Americas, and their satellites. And Okwui really sort of put his foot down and said there is no conversation around the global unless you're also including those former colonized areas, Latin America, South and East Asia, and and of course the African continent. So these kind of pressures, these kind of encounters are exactly the things that change everything for everyone. And it absolutely motivated the way in which he curated major exhibitions like international biennials.
Yeah, absolutely. That carried through all of those exhibitions. And Julie, I wanted to ask you, maybe starting specifically with the title of one of your works in the show, Black Monolith for Okwui Enwezor, Charlottesville. That's an interesting collusion of terms there. And I wondered if you could speak about Okwui and also what's behind that dedication.
Well, just to continue with what Naomi was saying, I moved to New York in the early 90s, and three shows that were really important to me, early shows, were Selma's Black Male Show, The Short Century, and the 93 Biennial. Those were kind of foundational shows in this way for how to be able to engage in this new kind of imaginary. And where I came from, you didn't really have that form of in Michigan and the Midwest. There weren't really contemporary art institutions. The MCA was one of the first, and now you have them everywhere, including in East Lansing. But one of the, I think, most generative aspects of those exhibitions was the kind of terrain that it opened and made possible for many of us artists coming up at that time. And especially having been born in Ethiopia and being raised there for the early part of years, having lived in Zimbabwe 4 years after the Mugabe government just began and after the 1980 revolution, that entire kind of the decolonial moment was so foundational to who I am and to who our generation, this whole generation of us. But not just for me. What was amazing about Okwi's kind of opening and how Naomi eloquently articulated that opening up in the art world is that it provided this place for this kind of cosmopolitan approach and thinking in terms of the production of knowledge and, across these multitudes and across these kind of multiple modernities that you're talking about, and having grown through that and experienced that, making that center to the conversation. Okwui is in many ways one of the best post-nationalist thinkers in that sense, that his interest was not necessarily being Nigerian but really about this kind of transcontinental trans knowledge building that happens when you really do live in this very cosmopolitan, globalized context. And I think one of the things he really provided in this country is, or he was able to expand that into the intellectual framework for a lot of knowledge making, and really, like in the same way Saidiya Hartman's able to do that with her writing in terms of thinking of early, going back to Black women in this country as being the first modernists. Really, like Okwui made that part of the argument around, and opened up the idea, kind of shattered the idea of the North Atlantic European avant-garde, or to consider that, and really to show the kind of how constant this avant-garde had been. So when you talk about, so to me, that was revolutionary kind of terrain to be able to work in and play in and make it. And the reason that I titled that painting after Okwui is the day that he died is the day I was actually finished working on the drawing layer of that painting, and I'd been working on it for a long time. And there's a blurred photograph immersed in the painting that is of the rally to the right in Charlottesville, in Charlottesville. When was that? 2016 or 17? Can't remember now, but I think it was 2017. And so I started the painting then, but I didn't finish. I had it in my studio for a long time, and then I kept turning it and working on it. But the day that Okwui died, I got the news that he died, and I was listening to music. I had been speaking to him on the phone the week before, and I finished this painting. And so there's two nods in that title. One nod is to Jack Whitten and his monolith paintings that he titled paintings, kind of makes these memorial paintings for the really important people. And that came up for me in terms of thinking around this painting. But it was Okwi's painting when I got that news, and he was kind of immersed in that painting. And so that's how that title came about.
Right. And Theaster, we spoke earlier about Okwi's mentorship, almost a kind of familial friendship, and the way he encouraged Black artists. I wonder if you want to speak a little more about that.
Yeah, well, I'll be honest that when I first saw the title, Grief and Grievance, it was really difficult not to conflate the grief of loss of Okwui with the title of the show. And so I think, that what Okwui did was, you could think of it as curation. It's curation because things are happening in biennials and in museums. But if before the occasion of meeting Okwui, I felt like I couldn't bring my entire practice to the museum, it was Okwui that gave permission to be my whole self. And he gave us all permission to be as fabulous as we wanted to be as radically thinking, to be as intellectually cohesive and coherent. And I think that some of that coherence in the ongoing conversations where he would just say, go further, you're not going far enough. It's evident that there's more in there. And I think that it had its own, it did, I said that it felt paternal, but not in a negative paternal. It felt like a loving hand or a big brother or someone that you deeply believe in who has knowledge of the field, telling you that the field doesn't know you and won't know you unless you show up. And that he was making space for us so that we could show up to be our whole selves. And I think a lot of times with curators in curation, you have the burden of the institution reducing what one brings so that it fits into the budget or it fits into the schema or it fits. But I think that with Okwi's style of curating and loving artists, it felt like it was constantly additive. Like, yes, we should do the sound. Yes, we should bring all the, we should bring it all. And I think that was very important for the growth of my my life. And I've observed Okwi's conversations with other artists where it's a very stern push, like further, further, harder, and you could tell that if I went further, I was solving both my artistic objective and Okwi's curatorial demand of the larger curatorial system. That if artists of color and Black artists do their best, that curation could do its best, and then institutions could do their best, and that was special.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to pursue that a little more. I mean, one of the things that I loved so much about the Venice Biennale in 2015, which I wrote a concluding chapter in my book, Black Performance on the Outskirts of the Left, about that exhibition, was how incredible it sounded everywhere you went, and your work was part of that. So I wonder if you want to talk about Gone Are the Days of Shelter and Martyr, or how sonic materials play in organizing this work and organizing these exhibitions for you.
Yeah. This exhibition, in a way, was about or my work in the Venice Biennale was about mourning the loss of this very historic church that was in a neighborhood very close to where I live, which also felt like I was mourning the possibility of its choir, its pastor, its beauty and awe of this Catholic church. And as the church was being demolished, as bulldozers were moving, we decided to do the last sermon in that space. And so this idea that as the church was leaving, in a way, God was leaving. And for me, the loss wasn't just the loss of a Catholic building, but there was a kind of spiritual fabric that was being erased and replaced with strip malls. So the architectural site of my neighborhood was losing its sacredness and losing its big buildings and losing the kind of architectural power that it once held when non-Blacks lived in this neighborhood. So I was able to kind of rescue these materials. But again, the martyrdom was about what happens when the creative and artistic leadership of a place leaves, or the spiritual leadership of a place leaves. Anyway, there was sound, and just at the end of the film, and once we kind of decided on the thing, Okwui was like, "You should bring the monks. You guys should perform in the space." That had not been part of the ambition, and I was really uncomfortable bringing religious music to the Venice Biennale. And he was like, "This is your music. This is our music. Why would you ever be embarrassed by a kind of an immaterial light that you carry that matters?" And so I think that in that way, I had been wanting to bury my interest in gospel music and maybe my emotion not very well. And that Okwui was then just kind of strongly encouraging the monks to be present. And we just rocked the fuck out. I mean, we just had a ball the way you would at like someone's 15th birthday. You know, it was like, then the Arsenale felt like, I don't know, it felt like a family reunion. you know.
Amazing. Thank you, Theaster. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about something I introduced in the beginning, and this is a topic I'm, at academic conferences and curatorial premises. This is something that, Black people maybe have a specific insight into, and it's this idea that we arrive at through a kind of modernist European distinction, which separates representation from abstraction. And of course, in Black life, abstraction and representation refer to much more than that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how these terms operate in the show, and ask you, Naomi, if you would jump into that.
Yeah, sure. You're spot on. There's a false binary between abstraction and representation. Abstraction and figuration, these are false binaries set up through a Western modernist dichotomy. And as Julie ever so eloquently pointed out, Okwui arrived to explode those false binaries and those false understandings of how we think through form, line, and color, which is to say, essentially, that abstraction can have content, figuration can be absolutely void, and it's really about legibility. You know, what cultural signs and symbols become legible to certain people, and as you rightly point out, Theaster, you do what you do, and whoever can read them, and other folks can get acclimated. What I think is really interesting too, though, in that kind of explosion of binaries, Okwui was really invested in some basic things that are carried out through the show. And one is that he was absolutely and rightly resistant to spectacle. And so in the exhibition in particular, you do not see the spectacularization or even straight visualizations of Black grief. What he's really interested in is using those key, maybe sort of methodologies of abstraction, which is to take something and enlarge it, to take something as a coda, perhaps, and really turn it into signs and symbols, and ways into the affect of grief, ways into the kind of political registers of grief, and ways into the formal registers of grief. And so you see a kind of literal understanding of abstraction working its way through the show, Julie's work, in Mark Bradford's work, but you also see abstraction working its way through in terms of how things get sublimated through the body. So exactly the phenomenon that Theaster just spoke about in Venice, the sonic, the performative, dance, movement, all become part of the ways in which emotion and affect really get moved through the body and onto cultural crystallization is the word that he used. But I'm also interested in what feels like maybe an abstract term that Okwui introduced some years ago, even in his work, especially thinking through the work of Lorna Simpson, one that you spoke about quickly, Malik, and that is the question of the racial sublime. And it's a term that Okwui used to talk about the American context, and he doesn't really define it, but he basically makes it analogous to a form of madness. So what do you do in the place of madness? What do you do in the space, in a mental space that you may not be able totally to apprehend and understand. And so I'm interested in the way the sublime becomes an operative term in Lorna's work, specifically in the show, a work called Nightlight, this beautiful, almost traditional sublime object giving you this landscape that is beyond reason, beyond even wanting to inhabit it. But you can't really see this clearly in this image on the screen, but I hope everyone gets a chance to see it on site. Within that beautiful sort of nocturnal sublime landscape is the specter of blackness, is the underlayer blackness. And I'm really interested in the way that specter of blackness can come through the sublime, or even undergird the sublime. That underlying blackness, even the underlying anti-black violence, is another, I think, animating force behind Jack Whitten, who also gives us this kind of traditional modernist idiom, the monochrome painting, the modernist sort of object that looks like it's turning in on itself. But underneath that surface in Jack Whitten's work, Birmingham, is a photograph, a reproduction of an image of a protester. And actually, I think, just anecdotally, I don't think this man was a protester. I think he was a bystander being attacked by police and police dogs. And so Whitten gives it in a kind of personal testimonial. It gives it sort of pride of place as literally the foundation of his work as a Black artist, really thinking instead not just about production of an image and a monochrome image, but production of a kind of bodily register and performance in creating the work. I was really interested also in the way in which, someone like Warhol very famously took an image from that same protest and then makes it part of his Race Riot series. And Warhol was famous for taking these images of trauma and really thinking about the ways in which through their spectacularization, they become banal, they become so normalized in American culture. And he's absolutely right about that. But, I really am thinking about this in contradistinction to Whitten, who is really not just looking at the spectacle of violence, but living through anti-Black violence, and how in his painting, that image resurfaces again with all the force and the violence that is enacted upon him.
Yeah, that's so deep, Naomi, yes. And
yeah, super deep.
And I wanted to
It makes me also think of that Yves Klein painting, the Malevich painting, the Black Square, which also, what was found about that painting recently? Naomi, can you tell us? Because I'll botch the story.
Well, that we see Malevich painting these paintings that are essentially monochromes, but they're actually the realization of jokes.
Yeah.
And so there are a series of jokes, many of them French, some of them Russian, about people in colored situations, like apoplectic nuns in red in a tomato fight, or 4 coal miners in a basement, in a fight. I'm sort of paraphrasing and making it up. But what we're getting at is the fact that Malevich's sort of realization of these monochrome works were really about a kind of failure to imagine a different kind of body. That there was there's a cinematic kind of scene activating it all, but it really was, in the end, in some cases, the erasure of race. And in fact, I'm sure Jack Whitten also knew closer to home for us in the American context, someone like Robert Rauschenberg, who was also famously making monochrome paintings, his Black paintings and his white paintings, actually had newsprint underneath. And those newsprints were editorial pages from Southern newspapers. And he noticed that even the editorial pages, or not even, the classified ads, the classified ads were segregated. So he had Black classified ads underneath the Black paintings and white classified ads underneath the white paintings. This kind of knowledge that you alluded to earlier, Julie, knowledge that lives in certain communities, are exactly the things that Whitten really wanted to bring to the fore, that there's a bodily knowledge and a racialized knowledge that actually motivates and catalyzes what looks like abstract forms.
Yeah, I think it was actually Black bodies or Negroes fighting in a cellar at night, something like that. It was really kind of a racist joke that was the underpinning of that painting.
And shows us again that these questions aren't really sort of a later development that we admit
Yeah,
into
not at all.
in modernism as we start to think about Black people, but rather they are the founding premises of modernity and modernism,
Yeah.
as generations of scholarship have shown us now. Julie, I wanted to ask you more about this as maybe one of the contemporary artists we think of at the fulcrum of abstraction and representation, but also about this idea of the sublime that Naomi introduced.
Yeah. So one of the moments where one of the most kind of profound moments I had with Okwui, which were many, but Okwui has this capability of coming into the studio and somehow whipping up these words through conversation with you, but in front of a work where all of a sudden all these things you're thinking about, he just kind of materializes into this form of language. And that's really hard to do that. And it's hard to do that for your own work, but it's amazing when you see that happening and somebody articulating so clearly and succinctly and kind of in a really profound way what you're trying to do. So I tend to work very intuitively, and I think in the next slide or the slides coming up, you'll see some of the images of the project that I was working on when I had my last studio with Okwui. But I was working on these enormous paintings that were for the lobby of SF MoMA. And the paintings are titled Howl 1 and Howl 2. And there are these two walls that face you as you walk in. And something about their orientation when I saw them at the site reminded me of the national parks and the vistas you get when you're on one crevice looking to another. And that was just an intuitive kind of response to the space. But being in the space there and thinking about that and coming back and thinking about how would I deal with this site, SF MoMA, building this incredible museum that like in terms of scale and capability, becomes one of the top museums in this country without the kind of history that a lot of really amazing, strong museums have here. And the reason for that is the enormous wealth that's located there. But part of that comes from the kind of Silicon Valley wealth and new wealth, but it was always the kind of end of the westward expansion project, and thinking about that in terms of this country and the colonial project of this country and Manifest Destiny, and that being the kind of materialization of that in a way. But on the flip side of that, while that project was really happening, while we were making these kind of state parks, while these painters were painting, Bierstadt was painting the Sierra Nevadas, and this is how the East Coast learned of this, the majesty of these spaces, you had an immense genocidal project happening to create these national parks at the same time that it was the time of the Civil War and emancipation, just shortly after, where you had really different complicated aspects in the landscape that are embedded in this idea of these sublime romantic paintings that kind of in a way, do what is expected of the sublime by creating awe and this kind of closeness to God and mortality or whatever. But what struck me about the reason I used these paintings, I blurred them into there was a huge amount of, the Black Lives Matter protests were taking place, and you had this enormous kind of surge. It felt, I don't even know if it was a real surge in extrajudicial killings of Black people, or if it was just the news was treating it differently, but that felt like this surge. And you had these expansive protests, from the protests in London after the murder of Mark Duggan by the police in 2011, and the explosion all over the UK in all the cities of protests and riots, to Ferguson, and here after the murder of Freddie Gray in Baltimore, you had these enormous. So I was embedding these blurred photos of these protests and these actions into the landscape, and kind of mapping them into that somehow with the way that I was working with Photoshop, and was able to digitally output that on this large canvas. And it was that I started to paint into. And when I was working on that, Okwui said to me, one of the frames was mapping the colonial sublime. And immediately that it was this way of trying to think through this time. It was the time I was working on this right after the election of Trump. And the thoughts leading into the pre-painting or the underpainting of the painting were really through the election and through the kind of racist language that became so prevalent and so at the surface. What was shocking about it was how much it was just part of the public narrative in a way. and accepted as such. And that's what was so devastating about that election. And I think that for me, somehow making these paintings was a way to process that. And it's an intuitive kind of response of trying to process all of that and digest that atmosphere. But the horror and the kind of the deeper kind of what AJ calls that kind of abject sublime that comes up in that time, like the insistence on wanting to make these paintings and wanting them to kind of go elsewhere. And I think that other images will come up in a matter of time. Maybe the next one will show like some of the images of the paintings. But anyway, that was kind of these two paintings really tried to. This was their point of departure. They were both titled Howl after that enormous poem by Allen Ginsberg, but that was also responding to a previous time of a similar kind of energy and a similar kind of response to place, time, and social action. And I think for me, it was thinking about the land as also that politicized space, that politicized witness, but also the recalling of those fundamental fears that are embedded in that. So yeah, I think in terms of the images, we can leave them, but.
I wanted to ask you if you want to comment in your work, how these terms, representation, abstraction, or this kind of working them through the kind of colonial or Black frame changes them.
Well, I think for me, like that.
Julie, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I thought you were asking. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah. Theaster, go ahead.
No, Julie, I loved hearing you talk about this stuff. I mean, it's really, I think it's really important. You know, I was just going to make the brief comment. One day when I was preparing to go to Venice, I told Okwui that the monks might start speaking in tongues or like anything might happen. And his response was, Theaster, some things are not meant to be understood. And I think that, you know, when I think about representation, like if a person hasn't heard of Earth, Wind, and Fire, I can't explain to them the song September. The song couldn't be any more representational, but if you're not familiar with it, it'll seem like abstraction, you know? And so I think that there's just the truth for me that the modalities of artistic form they should be complicated. If you look at the psyche of the Black experience, one may have to code for survival. One may not even know that they're coding to protect themselves. And so if it's not just about these fake binaries that I think Naomi's, you know, eloquently alluding to, that it's like those binaries were made for other people. But if it's about what a person has to work out in their body, through their soul, their catharsis in their studio with their materials, that sometimes the things that come out of us won't be understood, no matter what form they take. And so I'm really excited for the idea that there should be more attention given to process and asking those questions about process and not just the conversations of output. Because I think that sometimes output doesn't give us access to the complexity of the thing that's producing the thing we see.
Absolutely. Some things are not meant to be understood. We can always take that away with us tonight. And Julie, did you have another comment you wanted to make along these lines?
No, just was adding to that thing. I mean, thinking about the sublime as beyond reason and understanding, and the horror of existence, despite every effort to extinguish it, is that's what it is. I mean, that is that space that it's being made in. Goes back to Sadia's two girls in the hold, or Toni Morrison's A Mercy, or
Toni Morrison's birthday today.
Oh, really?
Yes. Sorry to interrupt you. And A Mercy was the last Toni Morrison novel I read.
And Audre Lorde's yesterday.
Yeah. Say that again?
Audre Lorde's as well.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Wow.
Sorry to interrupt with my trivia, but
no, I love it. I love it.
We have to acknowledge
but
our
it's
heroes.
Not trivia, Malik. I think this is one of the interesting things that is rarely talked about with Okwui, and that is that the genesis of his work was really around poetry. And so we can talk all day also about its eloquence, but But we have to also remember that he was interested in the way that sometimes language goes outside of understanding. And that was a really beautiful thing to also learn from and learn through with him as well.
Yeah. We're at the end of our time, but I want to offer my thanks to Naomi Beckwith, Julie Mehretu, Theaster Gates, and Massimiliano Gioni for their contribution to today's event. I want to offer a thank you to the New Museum, to Sotheby's, to Artforum, and Intelligence Squared. And I hope you enjoyed watching this evening. I guess we're in different time zones. It's about 6:20 in New York City, and it's a lovely, cool evening. So I hope you have some other evening to go into and enjoy yourselves. Grief and Grievance, Art and Mourning in America is open at the New Museum in New York City. All right, thank you so much.
Malik, thank you so much. Thank
Malik,
you all.
So much love.
Thank you all.
Thank you
Yeah,
all.
thank you.
Really great to see you all.
Right.
Thank you.
Bye.